Imagine a city bathed in golden sunlight. The marble temples of Athens shine against the blue sky. Philosophers debate in the agora. Soldiers march through narrow streets. Merchants shout prices of olive oil and wine. It's the 5th century BCE, the height of Greek power, art, and democracy. But in the middle of this brilliance walks a man who seems out of place, barefoot, poorly dressed, unshaven. His face is rough, his eyes deep in questioning. He carries no money, owns no land, and yet everyone in the city knows his name. Some love him, others avoid him. Some call him wise, others call him dangerous. That man is Socrates, and he will become one of the most important thinkers in all of human history, even though he never wrote a single word. Socrates wasn't born into wealth or privilege. Around 470 BCE, in a small home in Athens, he entered a world that prized beauty, strength, and success. His father, Socrates, was a stonemason. His mother, Phanerete, was a midwife. These humble beginnings shaped him more than anyone realized. His mother helped bring life into the world, and later, Socrates would claim to do the same, but for the mind. He said that just as a midwife helps a mother give birth, he helped people give birth to ideas. Growing up, Athens was a city full of contrasts. It was a democracy, but one built on slavery. It was a land of great art and philosophy, but also of constant war. Socrates saw both the glory and the hypocrisy of his city, and it made him question everything. As a young man, Socrates trained as a soldier. He fought bravely in several battles, Patadia, Dilium, and Amphipolis. He stood barefoot in the snow, fearless and calm, while others struggled. Even in war, he was known not for his strength, but for his strange courage and self-control. He never panicked, he never boasted. He simply acted according to reason. But when he returned to Athens, something in him had changed. He began to see the city differently. While others chased fame and wealth, Socrates began to chase truth. He spent his days in the marketplace, not selling goods, but asking questions, simple questions that cut deep. What is justice? What is courage? What makes a person good? At first, people laughed, but soon, they realized these weren't ordinary questions. When someone tried to answer, Socrates would gently keep asking, peeling away their assumptions until they realized they didn't know as much as they thought. This became known as the Socratic method, a way of discovering truth through questions. It wasn't about giving answers. It was about exposing ignorance and forcing people to think. To understand why Socrates mattered so much, we have to understand Athens itself. In the 5th century BCE, Athens was the jewel of Greece, a powerful democracy that prided itself on freedom of speech, art, and reason. It was the age of Pericles when the Parthenon was built, when theater and sculpture flourished, and when philosophers began to ask new questions about the universe and human life. But beneath that glory was something fragile. Athens was proud, ambitious, and often arrogant. Its democracy was young and easily swayed. The city had just survived wars with Persia and was now locked in a brutal struggle with its rival, Sparta, the Peloponnesian War. As the city suffered defeats and political chaos, people began to look for someone to blame. And in that tense environment, a man who questioned everything, including the government, religion, and authority, began to seem dangerous. Socrates didn't teach in a classroom. He didn't charge money like other philosophers. He taught anyone who would listen, young men, craftsmen, soldiers, even slaves. He became especially influential among Athenian youth, those eager to challenge their elders and rethink society. Men like Plato, who would later record Socrates' teachings and ensure his legacy lived on. But not everyone admired him. Many politicians and sophists, teachers who claimed to know everything, saw him as a threat. The sophists taught rhetoric, the art of persuasion, and often used it to win arguments or gain power. Socrates hated that. He believed truth should never be twisted for personal gain. So he challenged them, exposed their contradictions, and humiliated them in public. The powerful didn't forget that. What made Socrates so different was his view of knowledge. He once said, "I know that I know nothing." To most, that sounded absurd. How could a man be wise if he admitted ignorance? But that was the point. True wisdom, he believed, begins with recognizing how little you actually know. He believed every person had a moral responsibility to examine their life, to ask what was right, what was just, what was worth living for. The unexamined life, he said, is not worth living. These ideas were revolutionary. They shifted philosophy from studying the stars to studying the soul, from asking, what is the universe made of, to asking, what kind of person should I be? That's why Socrates is often called the father of Western philosophy. Yet, his search for truth came at a price. As Athens declined after the Peloponnesian War, people grew bitter and afraid. The democracy that once celebrated free thought turned suspicious of those who questioned too much. In 399 BCE, Socrates was brought to trial. The charges were shocking: corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods of Athens. In reality, his real crime was teaching people to think for themselves. When he stood before the jury of 500 citizens, he refused to beg for mercy. Instead, he gave one of the most powerful defenses in history. He said he was a gift from the gods, a gadfly sent to sting the lazy horse that was Athens. He told them he would rather die than stop questioning the truth. The jury found him guilty. The sentence: death by drinking poison hemlock. Even at the end, Socrates remained calm. His friends urged him to escape, but he refused. He believed obeying the law, even an unjust one, was part of his moral duty. As he drank the cup of poison, his students wept. He spoke softly, saying that death might simply be a peaceful sleep, or a journey to another place where he could continue his questions. And then, with quiet dignity, the man who had questioned everything asked no more. But Socrates didn't really die that day. His ideas lived on through his students, especially Plato, who would go on to build the foundations of Western philosophy. Through Plato's writings, and later Aristotle's, the spirit of Socrates would shape how we think about truth, morality, and reason for thousands of years. His death wasn't just the end of one man. It was a warning and a lesson. A warning about what happens when society fears free thought, and a lesson about the power of one person's courage to stand by their beliefs, no matter the cost. Socrates showed the world that wisdom isn't about having all the answers, it's about never stopping the questions. His life reminds us that truth often makes people uncomfortable, and that those who challenge the world are often the ones who change it. In a city that claimed to love wisdom, Athens silenced its wisest man. But in doing so, it ensured that his voice would echo through all of history. Because the questions Socrates asked about justice, virtue, and the meaning of life are still the questions we struggle with today. Socrates was born around 470 BCE in a small district just outside the heart of Athens called Alapes. It wasn't a place of wealth or luxury, but a modest corner of a city rising toward greatness. The marble temples that would one day define Athens were still being built. The air was filled with the sound of chisels striking stone, voices bargaining in the marketplace, and the laughter of children playing between dusty roads. Among those children was a boy who didn't stand out much from the rest. He wasn't born into a noble family, nor trained from birth for politics or command. His father, Socrates, was a sculptor, a craftsman who shaped stone into forms of beauty and strength. His mother, Phanerete, was a midwife, helping women bring life into the world. From his parents, Socrates inherited two symbols that would define his destiny. From his father, the art of shaping matter with patience and skill, and from his mother, the gift of guiding others through birth, though his would be the birth of ideas. Life in Athens during this time was full of contrasts. It was a city awakening to new ideas, where poets, thinkers, and artists pushed the limits of imagination. But it was also a place of hierarchy and discipline. The gods of Olympus still ruled the hearts of men, and tradition shaped every part of life, from education to politics. As a boy, Socrates followed the typical Athenian path of education, though his family's modest means meant he did not have the tutors reserved for the elite. Still, Athens was a city that valued learning. Every freeborn boy was expected to be educated to read, write, and recite the poetry of Homer, to study music and gymnastics, to understand the myths and laws that defined their world. Socrates would have begun his days before sunrise, walking to the gymnasium with other boys his age. There, under the watch of stern instructors, they trained their bodies in running, wrestling, and discus throwing. Physical perfection was considered a form of moral beauty. To the Greeks, a sharp mind deserved a strong body, and education was meant to build both. After the physical lessons came the lessons of the mind. He learned to read and write using wax, tablets, and styluses. He would copy lines from Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, memorizing the stories of Achilles, Odysseus, and the gods. Through these epic poems, young Athenians absorbed their cultures, ideals, courage, honor, loyalty, and glory. Yet something in Socrates' mind was different. While others admired the hero's strength and victories, he seemed more curious about their choices, about why they fought, why they suffered, what it meant to be good or just. Even as a boy, he questioned the meaning behind the stories, looking not for entertainment, but for truth. At home, he likely spent time with his father, learning the patient art of sculpture. Socrates would have shown him how to carve marble, how to see form within stone before it emerged. Socrates might have practiced shaping small figures, his hands covered in white dust. Perhaps this experience, seeing potential hidden inside something rough and shapeless, helped shape his way of thinking later in life. For Socrates would one day do the same with the human mind, chipping away false beliefs until the truth revealed itself. From his mother, he learned something just as profound. Fanaret's work as a midwife wasn't only physical. It required empathy, calm, and deep understanding. She helped others through pain, guiding them toward new life. Socrates would later say that he too was a kind of midwife, but instead of helping women give birth to children, he helped men give birth to wisdom. He never claimed to give people knowledge himself, only to help them bring out the truth they already carried inside. This idea, though simple, would become one of the most revolutionary concepts in philosophy. But for now, he was just a curious boy in a city of endless voices. Athens itself was his greatest teacher. Walking through its bustling agora, he saw merchants arguing over prices, politicians speaking in the assembly, and poets performing verses about gods and heroes. He absorbed the rhythms of daily life, the constant debate, the hunger for beauty, the pursuit of excellence. To live in Athens during its golden age was to breathe in ideas. Every corner of the city echoed with thought and discussion. Education in Athens wasn't confined to classrooms. It was everywhere, in conversations, in art, in politics. Young men learned not just from their masters, but from observing their elders, listening to orators, and taking part in public life. As Socrates grew older, he began to see that knowledge wasn't just what was written on tablets. It was in people, in their actions, in their contradictions. He may have studied under philosophers of his time, like Anaxagoras, who taught that the universe was guided by a mind or intelligence, nous, or perhaps he was influenced by the Sophists, who taught the art of rhetoric and persuasion. But Socrates would soon grow critical of these teachers, feeling that they cared more about clever arguments than about truth itself. Even as a youth, he was known for spending long hours lost in thought. He would stand still for minutes, sometimes hours, thinking deeply about a single question. While other boys were chasing games or showing off their strength, Socrates was more interested in the workings of the mind. People began to notice him quiet, strange, always asking why. Still, in these early years, there was little sign that he would one day become a philosopher who would challenge the entire city. He was simply an Athenian boy, shaped by the same traditions and expectations as the rest. He would have taken part in religious festivals, honoring the gods of Olympus. He would have watched the great dramas of Aeschylus and Sophocles performed in open-air theaters, absorbing the tragic stories that reflected the moral struggles of man. These experiences would stay with him. Greek tragedies explored the same questions he would later ask. What is justice? What is fate? How much control does a person really have over their actions? Even before he could articulate it, the seeds of his philosophy were being planted. As he entered adolescence, Athens was transforming rapidly. The city was growing wealthier and more powerful. The great leader Pericles was rising, turning Athens into a democracy unlike any the world had seen. Citizens gathered to vote on laws, to debate in public, to take part in shaping their city's destiny. For a young mind like Socrates, this was the perfect environment, a world alive with questions, argument, and discovery. Yet behind all the progress, there was pressure. Athenian boys were expected to grow into strong, successful men, soldiers, citizens, fathers. Philosophy was a pastime for the rich or eccentric, not a path to follow seriously. But Socrates never seemed interested in the usual ambitions. He wasn't driven by wealth or fame. What fascinated him were the deeper things, the invisible threads that held human life together. Some accounts suggest that he studied music and geometry, as was common in Athenian education. These subjects trained the mind in harmony and order, ideas that would later influence his thinking. The Greeks saw no division between the physical and the intellectual. To know music was to understand balance. To know mathematics was to touch the perfection of the divine. Still, Socrates' education wasn't extraordinary in itself. What made him different was how he used it. While others learned to win arguments, he learned to ask better questions. While others sought recognition, he sought meaning. By his late teens, he would have completed his formal education and begun preparing for military service, as was required of every Athenian male. The boy who once carved marble and read Homer would soon find himself standing on the battlefield. But even before that, his mind had already begun its lifelong war against ignorance. The Athens that raised him gave him everything: stories, heroes, teachers, traditions. But it also gave him something he couldn't ignore: contradictions. He saw men praise justice, yet act unjustly. He saw leaders speak of wisdom but chase power. And in those contradictions, he found his purpose. It was here, in the ordinary streets of Athens, that the mind of Socrates began to awaken. The boy from Alabes was becoming a thinker, not because he was taught what to think, but because he was brave enough to ask why. And as he grew into adulthood, those questions would no longer stay quietly in his mind. They would spill into the world, challenging everyone he met, from the humblest craftsman to the most powerful statesman. The lessons of his childhood, patience from his father, empathy from his mother, and curiosity from his city would guide him as he stepped into the public life of Athens. He didn't know it yet, but the same city that taught him to think would one day condemn him for doing it too well. Socrates grew into a young man during one of the most exciting intellectual periods in Athens. The city was alive with conversation. Poets, mathematicians, and philosophers all searching for answers to questions no one had asked before. Knowledge wasn't hidden in temples or scrolls. It lived in the streets, in arguments, in ideas shared over wine and olive oil. Athens had become a school for the entire Greek world. For a boy born without wealth or high family name, this world of thinkers might have seemed distant, but Socrates found his way into it through sheer curiosity. His father's workshop had introduced him to the patience of craftsmanship, but Athens itself was the true workshop of his mind. He began to seek out anyone who could teach him, not for reputation, but for understanding. Among his first influences was Anaxagoras of Clazomene, a philosopher who had settled in Athens years before. Anaxagoras was unlike the storytellers or poets who filled the city's theaters. He spoke not of gods and myths, but of reason and natural forces. He claimed that the sun was not a god, but a blazing stone, and that the moon shone by reflecting its light. For many Athenians, this bordered on blasphemy. But for Socrates, it was revelation. The idea that the universe could be explained through logic and observation rather than divine stories planted a deep seed in his thinking. Anaxagoras introduced a word that would stay with Socrates for life: nous, meaning mind. He believed that a divine intelligence governed the order of the cosmos, setting everything in motion. The thought that behind the chaos of the world there might be reason and design fascinated Socrates. He would later take this idea and turn it inward, searching not for the logic of the stars, but for the logic of the human soul. Another important influence was Archelaus, a philosopher who had studied under Anaxagoras and became one of Socrates' early teachers. Archelaus tried to explain the world through a mixture of science and philosophy: how life began, how the earth formed, how right and wrong were not just divine commands, but products of nature and reason. From him, Socrates may have learned to connect the physical and moral worlds, to see that understanding nature and understanding the self were parts of the same journey. Through these early lessons, Socrates developed a habit that would define his entire life. He questioned everything he was told. Where most students accepted the teachings of their masters, Socrates wanted to test them. He didn't reject knowledge, but he refused to take it on faith. He wanted proof, reason, dialogue. Athens at the time offered a broad and demanding education for its young men. Every freeborn boy was expected to learn the skills of both body and mind. The curriculum began with grammar, learning to read, write, and interpret the works of great poets. The verses of Homer, Hesiod, and Pindar were not just literature. They were moral instruction, shaping ideals of courage, loyalty, and virtue. Music followed closely, for the Greeks believed music shaped the soul. The rhythm of the lyre and the melody of the flute were meant to teach harmony, self-control, and sensitivity. Socrates, though never a musician himself, later spoke often of harmony, not in notes, but in character. Gymnastics trained the body. Physical excellence was seen as a reflection of inner order. Young men ran, wrestled, and boxed in the pale sunlight of the gymnasia, their teachers drilling discipline into every movement. Socrates joined these exercises, though he cared less for the glory of competition and more for endurance and self-mastery. Stories later told of him standing barefoot in the snow or marching calmly through battles come from this early belief that the mind ruled the body, not the other way around. Rhetoric was the crown of Athenian education. It was the art of persuasion, how to argue, how to move a crowd, how to win in the courts or the assembly. Most young men of ambition dreamed of becoming skilled speakers, for in a democracy, power belonged to words. Teachers known as sophists made fortunes teaching rhetoric, promising to turn anyone into a master of debate. But Socrates soon grew uneasy with rhetoric. He saw how easily it could be used to twist truth instead of reveal it. The sophists taught how to make the weaker argument appear stronger, to win, not to understand. To Socrates, this was corruption of the mind. It turned wisdom into a game and truth into a performance. He would later challenge these sophists in open debate, exposing their contradictions, not through shouting, but through calm, relentless questions. Still, in these years, Socrates learned from everyone, even those he disagreed with. From poets, he learned imagination. From scientists, the discipline of reason. From sophists, he learned how fragile truth becomes when language is used without honesty. Each influence, each idea, became a stone in the foundation of his thought. Beyond Athens, the wider Greek world was changing. A generation of thinkers known today as the pre-Socratic philosophers had already begun to transform how people saw the universe. These men, Thales, Heraclitus, Pythagoras, Parmenides, and others, were trying to explain existence without relying on myth. They searched for the hidden substance behind all things: water, fire, number, being itself. Thales of Miletus had claimed that everything came from water, a bold attempt to find a single principle behind nature. Heraclitus declared that everything was in constant change, saying, "You cannot step into the same river twice." Pythagoras saw numbers and harmony as the key to understanding reality, believing that the universe was structured by proportion and balance. Parmenides, on the other hand, insisted that change was an illusion, that true being was eternal and unchanging. These conflicting ideas fascinated Socrates. They showed him that even the greatest minds disagreed on the nature of truth. He admired their courage to question the old gods and look for natural causes, but he also felt that something was missing. These philosophers were concerned with the physical world, with what things were made of, but few asked how people should live. Socrates began to turn philosophy inward. Instead of asking, "What is the universe made of?" he started asking, "What kind of person should I be?" The shift from studying nature to studying the human soul would become his greatest legacy. He believed that knowledge without virtue was empty, that understanding the stars meant nothing if one didn't understand right and wrong. In his youth, this change wasn't yet clear. He was still learning, still searching, walking the narrow streets of Athens, lost in thought. But the direction was set. His teachers had given him tools: logic, observation, curiosity. Now he would use them not to study the heavens, but the heart of man. He began to notice something in the people around him. Politicians, poets, craftsmen, all claimed to know what they were doing, yet few could explain why. When a politician spoke of justice, Socrates wondered if he truly understood it. When a poet sang of love or courage, Socrates questioned what those words really meant. This restless questioning isolated him from many of his peers, but it also drew others to him. Young men who sensed that beneath his strange manner lay a kind of wisdom deeper than their teachers' speeches. He didn't lecture them. He asked them to think. In the open-air gymnasia and shaded courtyards of Athens, small groups began to gather around him. They didn't know it yet, but they were witnessing the birth of a new kind of philosophy, one that began not with theories about the stars, but with simple questions about everyday life. As he matured, Socrates carried within him the best of the Greek tradition: the discipline of the athlete, the rhythm of the poet, the reasoning of the scientist, and the skepticism of the philosopher. Yet he was not satisfied with any single part. He wanted to unite them all, to find the harmony between knowledge and virtue, between the mind and the soul. The lessons of his youth were shaping him into something Athens had never seen before. He was not a teacher in the ordinary sense. He was not a priest, nor a politician, nor a poet. He was something entirely new, a man who believed that the greatest truth was not written in books or carved in stone, but hidden inside every human being. waiting to be discovered through the power of a question. As Socrates grew older, the restless curiosity that had followed him since boyhood became impossible to contain. The world around him was full of voices, teachers, politicians, poets, and philosophers, all claiming to understand the nature of life and the gods. But to Socrates, their words often sounded hollow, like music played on broken strings. He began to sense that wisdom was not something a man could simply inherit from another. It had to be discovered within himself. Athens at that time was the intellectual heart of Greece. Every corner of the city hummed with discussion and debate. The young were taught by some of the finest minds of their generation. Among those who influenced Socrates, most were the natural philosophers who sought to explain the universe not through myth, but through reason. One of them was Anaxagoras, a thinker who dared to say that the sun was not a god, but a fiery stone, and that the moon shone by reflecting its light. Such ideas were radical in a city still deeply tied to its gods. To a mind like Socrates, they opened new doors, proof that the world could be questioned. Later, Socrates found himself drawn to Archelaus, a student of Anaxagoras, who became both mentor and friend. Archelaus introduced him to the notion that justice and morality might not come from the heavens, but from human society itself. It was a daring idea, one that quietly shifted the foundation of how Socrates saw the world. For the first time, he began to turn his gaze inward, not toward the stars or the myths of Olympus, but toward the human soul and its choices. Still, his education was not limited to philosophy. Like all young men of Athens, he studied grammar and music, learning to appreciate rhythm, poetry, and the power of words. He trained his body through gymnastics, for the Greeks believed a sound mind must live in a sound body. Rhetoric, too, was an essential art of the skill to persuade in courts and assemblies. But while others learned to use speech to gain power, Socrates saw in words something more profound, the key to uncovering truth. At first, he followed the usual path. He listened, memorized, and repeated, like every other student. But something inside him refused to be satisfied. He began asking his teachers questions they struggled to answer. What is justice? What is beauty? What is courage? Each answer only raised new questions. For every truth claimed, Socrates found cracks in its certainty. The influence of the pre-Socratic philosophers deepened this unease. Thinkers like Heraclitus, who said that everything flows and nothing stays the same, and Parmenides, who argued that change is an illusion, filled his mind with contradictions. If both men spoke truth, how could the world be both changing and unchanging? This tension fascinated him. He realized that truth was not found by accepting answers, but by examining them. As he walked through Athens' crowded markets, he began to see philosophy not as something confined to classrooms or scrolls, but as something living among people. Each craftsman, merchant, and politician had their own view of what was right or true. Socrates started speaking with them, not as a student, but as a fellow seeker. These early exchanges were clumsy, often frustrating, but they became the roots of his method, the art of questioning that would later make him famous. At home, his mother Phanerete had spent her life as a midwife, helping bring children into the world. Socrates often compared his own search for truth to her work. Just as she helped women deliver new life, he believed he was helping minds give birth to new ideas. It was a metaphor that would follow him for the rest of his life. The Athens of his youth was alive with contradictions. Great poets sang of heroes and gods, while scientists studied the movement of the stars. Politicians spoke of freedom, even as they sought power. It was a city of brilliance and vanity, of progress and decay. In that environment, Socrates learned the most important lesson of all, that true wisdom begins with admitting how little one knows. By the time he reached adulthood, Socrates was no longer a mere student. The lessons of Anaxagoras and Archelaus, the debates of Heraclitus and Parmenides, had given him tools but not answers. What they offered in theory, he wanted to test in life. Philosophy to him had to be lived, not lectured. He stopped writing, believing that written words were lifeless, unable to defend themselves or respond. Instead, he devoted himself to dialogue, to the living, breathing exchange of minds. His path was no longer that of a follower, but of an explorer. He would question everything: gods, traditions, authority, and even himself. This hunger for truth would soon lead him out of the classroom and into the streets of Athens, where ordinary people would become his teachers and his subjects. The city would be his school, and every conversation would be an experiment in the search for wisdom. As Socrates stepped into manhood, his mind had been shaped by the thinkers who came before him, but his spirit pushed beyond them. He had learned that philosophy was not about possessing knowledge, but about pursuing it endlessly. That realization would define his life, and eventually, his death. Athens was alive like never before. The air itself seemed to hum with the rhythm of ideas, art, and ambition. Marble temples gleamed under the sun, and wide streets echoed with the voices of orators, merchants, and soldiers returning from war. Under the leadership of Pericles, Athens had become not just a city, but a symbol, living monument to what the human mind could achieve when given freedom. For a young thinker like Socrates, it was the best and the worst of times. Everywhere he looked, Athens was bursting with confidence. It was the golden age, a time of democracy, art, and philosophy. Painters filled the walls with scenes of gods and heroes. Playwrights turned theaters into battlegrounds of ideas, and sculptors carved perfection from stone. The city had wealth from its empire, pride from its victories, and faith in its destiny. Pericles, the great statesman, had built the Parthenon, not just as a temple to Athena, but as a message to the world that Athens stood at the height of civilization. Citizens gathered in the agora, the marketplace where ideas traded hands as freely as silver. Democracy allowed nearly every free man to speak, to vote, and to shape the laws. It was a system built on words, on persuasion and reason. In this new world, the power of speech had become the key to power itself. But with this freedom came a new kind of competition. Men who once sought truth now sought victory. The sophists, professional teachers of rhetoric, began to fill the city. They traveled from place to place, offering lessons to anyone who could pay, promising to turn ordinary men into masters of persuasion. To them, truth was not absolute, it was whatever could convince a crowd. Athens loved them. In a city where every decision was made by debate, being able to speak well meant survival. Young men from wealthy families crowded into the sophist schools, eager to learn the art of argument. Names like Protagoras, Gorgias, and Hippias became famous. They claimed that for every argument, there was an equal and opposite one. If a man could make the weaker argument appear stronger, he was a genius. Socrates watched this rise with unease. He saw talented youths spending fortunes to learn how to win debates, not how to find truth. To him, their words were clever but hollow, crafted to please rather than to enlighten. He began to see that Athens' greatest strength, its democracy, was also its greatest danger. When truth becomes a matter of persuasion, justice becomes a matter of power. He began walking through the city, spending his days in the agora, in workshops, and at public gatherings. He would stop people, politicians, poets, generals, and ask simple questions. What is virtue? What is justice? What is courage? At first they laughed. To them these were easy questions. But as Socrates pressed further, their confidence would crumble. They realized they didn't know as much as they thought. Word spread about the strange man who questioned everyone but claimed to know nothing himself. Some admired him, others feared him. To the ambitious young men of Athens, he was a challenge and an inspiration. To the sophists, he was a threat. Unlike them, Socrates refused to take payment for teaching. He believed that wisdom was not a product to be sold, but a light to be shared. He told his followers that knowledge without virtue was dangerous, and that true understanding came from within. The city was divided about him. Some saw in Socrates the embodiment of Athens' spirit, the relentless pursuit of truth through reason. Others saw a man undermining tradition, mocking authority, and teaching the youth to question everything. But Socrates didn't seek fame. He lived simply, often barefoot, dressed in a single rough cloak, regardless of the season. He avoided wealth and luxury, believing that the pursuit of comfort dulled the pursuit of wisdom. Many thought his way of life foolish, even embarrassing. Yet for Socrates, simplicity brought clarity. While others debated in the assembly for applause, Socrates listened, questioned, and exposed contradictions. His way of thinking was like a mirror, forcing people to see their own ignorance reflected back at them. It wasn't cruelty, it was honesty. He believed that acknowledging one's ignorance was the first step toward wisdom. Athens, under Pericles, celebrated beauty, strength, and intelligence, but beneath its marble perfection, Socrates sensed a growing arrogance. The city that called itself free often silenced those who disagreed. The citizens who praised wisdom were often ruled by pride. Socrates began to understand that true freedom wasn't found in democracy alone, but in the liberation of the mind from false certainty. In the evenings, as the sun dipped behind the Acropolis, he could be found surrounded by students and curious onlookers. Among them were young men who would one day shape the future of philosophy: Plato, Xenophon, and Alcibiades. They listened as he spoke of the examined life, of virtue, and of the soul. He told them that to live without questioning was to live asleep. The golden age of Athens dazzled with brilliance, but Socrates saw its shadow. Behind the pride of the city, he sensed fragility of dependence on appearances, applause, and opinion. He realized that the same passion that built the Parthenon could also destroy those who dared to question its glory. As Pericles' Athens reached its peak, so too did its contradictions. The city that gave birth to philosophy also began to fear it. And the man who valued truth above all was slowly becoming a problem for a society built on reputation. Socrates continued his daily wanderings, never writing, never charging, never declaring himself a teacher. He was, in his own words, a midwife of ideas, helping others give birth to their own understanding. But his questions would soon reach the ears of those in power. And in a city where public opinion ruled, even the wisest man could find himself standing alone. The stage was set for conflict. Athens, proud and powerful, would soon turn its gaze inward, and Socrates, the man who questioned everything, would find himself questioning the very soul of his city. The city that once cheered its freedom had begun to lose patience with those who took that freedom too seriously. Socrates had become a familiar figure by now, a man who spent his days wandering through the agora, stopping anyone willing to listen, and anyone unwilling to. He asked the same simple questions, but the simplicity was deceptive. His words cut through pride like a blade through silk. To a craftsman, he might ask, "What makes your work good?" To a soldier, "What makes a man brave?" To a politician, "What makes a leader just?" Each conversation began easily, but soon the listener found himself tangled in his own contradictions. Socrates never lectured, never shouted, never claimed authority. He only asked, and in doing so, exposed how little even the most respected men truly knew. Athens was a city that loved talk, but not the kind that left people uneasy. In the shadow of the Parthenon, words were weapons. Orators rose in the assembly to stir the crowds. Sophists argued for profit, and politicians spoke of virtue while chasing power. For them, speech was a tool. For Socrates, it was a mirror. Among his regular listeners were some of the brightest young minds of Athens. Plato, quiet and thoughtful, followed him closely. Alcibiades, handsome and ambitious, admired him for his courage. Xenophon, practical and disciplined, wrote down what others forgot. They came to him not because he offered answers, but because he forced them to think. But not everyone admired him. The sophists, who made their living teaching persuasion, began to see Socrates as an obstacle. They offered certainty. He offered doubt. They promised success. He promised self-exaltation. To the ambitious youth of Athens, the choice was clear. The sophists could teach them to win arguments and gain influence. Socrates could only teach them how little they truly understood. Still, his presence couldn't be ignored. He drew crowds wherever he went, in the gymnasiums, in workshops, at banquets, or in the marketplace. His calm voice and piercing logic unsettled even the most confident men. There were stories of generals who left his company humiliated, poets who went silent, and politicians who avoided him entirely. Some began to whisper that he was dangerous, not because he broke laws, but because he broke illusions. He spoke against corruption, against vanity, against the blindness of those who thought themselves wise. Too many, that sounded like an attack on Athens itself. And yet, Socrates loved his city. He had fought in its wars, stood beside its soldiers, and endured its hardships. But he also saw how power and wealth had changed it. Athens, once united by courage, was now divided by ambition. The pursuit of honor had become the pursuit of victory. Truth had become flexible, twisted by whoever spoke loudest. Socrates refused to play that game. He believed that the strength of a democracy depended not on how well men spoke, but on how deeply they thought. A city, he said, could not survive if its citizens cared more for persuasion than for truth. When asked why he never wrote his ideas, he smiled and said that writing could not argue back. Words on a page could not defend themselves. True philosophy, he believed, lived only in conversation, in the clash of minds, in the moment of discovery. That belief made him unlike any teacher Athens had ever seen. Still, his constant questioning began to irritate those in power. The city's leaders, already wary of critics, saw his influence growing among the youth. They feared he was teaching them to challenge authority, and in a way, he was. Not through rebellion, but through reason. He taught them to question everything, even the gods, even the democracy they served. It was a dangerous time to stand apart. Athens was changing. The pride of the Golden Age was giving way to tension, political, social, and soon, military. But Socrates remained the same, barefoot, calm, and endlessly curious. Sometimes he would stand for hours in thought, motionless, as if wrestling with a question only he could hear. His students waited patiently, knowing that when he spoke again, his words would leave them transformed. He believed that every man carried within him the potential for wisdom, if only he could recognize his own ignorance. To admit I do not know was, for Socrates, the beginning of knowledge, and yet, to most Athenians, it sounded like weakness. In a city where confidence ruled, humility was hard to admire. Still, Socrates kept walking the same streets, talking to the same people, asking the same unanswerable questions. The same city that celebrated freedom of speech began to resent the man who used it best. He was not loud, not charismatic, not wealthy, but his influence ran deep. Those who spoke with him often found themselves changed, sometimes confused, sometimes enlightened, but never untouched. And as the laughter of the agora faded into the night, Socrates would often walk home alone, past the glowing temples and silent statues. To others, Athens looked perfect, its marble walls a symbol of greatness. To him, it was still a place of learning, a vast classroom filled with students who did not yet know they were being taught. He could not have known it then, but the world of Athens was beginning to tremble. The balance that had sustained its golden age was shifting. The same city that once lifted him as a symbol of its intellect would one day turn against him. But for now, in the glow of its greatness, Socrates kept asking, kept searching, and kept believing that a single question, honestly asked, could shake the foundations of an empire. By now, Socrates had become a familiar sight in the agora. Every day he could be found, standing among merchants and citizens, talking about everything except trade. His questions floated through the air like sparks, lighting minds and burning egos in equal measure. Some came to challenge him, others simply to watch, but no one left unchanged. He never lectured. He never gave speeches. His wisdom came not from declaring truth, but from uncovering it, piece by piece, question by question. To Socrates, philosophy was not about filling the mind with answers, but about clearing away illusions. He once said that his role was like that of a midwife. He helped others give birth to their own understanding. People began to call his approach the Socratic method, though he never gave it a name. It was not a method in the formal sense, but a way of living. He believed that truth was hidden inside everyone, buried beneath pride, habit, and fear. His task was to draw it out, not by telling people what to think, but by asking them why they thought as they did. It would begin with something simple. A man might say, "Courage is standing firm in battle." Socrates would nod gently in reply. Then is a man who stands firm because he is too afraid to flee, courageous, or merely frozen by fear. The man would hesitate. Another might offer, "Courage is knowing what to fear." Socrates would smile. Then is a man who fears nothing at all, courageous, or merely ignorant. Round and round it would go, each answer leading to another question, until what once seemed certain began to crumble. By stripping away false confidence, Socrates revealed how fragile human understanding truly was. His students both loved and feared this process. Conversations with him could feel like standing in sunlight, blinding at first, but impossible to forget. Plato, in particular, became fascinated by how these dialogues revealed the mind at work. Later, he would write them down, preserving not just Socrates' words, but the rhythm of his questioning. Through these writings, Euthyphro, Apology, Crito, and others, the world would come to know the man who never wrote a single book. One of his most famous exchanges was with Euthyphro, a man who claimed to know what piety meant. Socrates asked him to define it. Euthyphro said piety was what is loved by the gods. Socrates then asked, is it loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it pious because it is loved by the gods? The question unraveled Euthyphro's certainty. If something is good only because the gods love it, then goodness depends on their whim. But if the gods love it because it is good, then goodness exists independently of them. In one question, Socrates shifted the foundation of morality from divine authority to human reasoning. Another dialogue was with Meno, who confidently asked if virtue could be taught. Socrates responded by asking what virtue even was. Meno struggled to define it, listing examples: courage, justice, moderation, but failing to find a single essence that tied them together. Through questioning, Socrates guided him to see that true understanding required knowing not just examples, but the principle behind them. Through these conversations, Socrates showed that ignorance was not shameful, only the refusal to confront it was. To him, wisdom began with admitting "I do not know." That humility, he believed, opened the path to discovery. This set him apart from the sophists, who filled Athens' schools and courts. They sold lessons in rhetoric, teaching how to win any argument, no matter the truth. To them, success meant persuasion. To Socrates, it meant enlightenment. While sophists charged gold for clever words, Socrates charged nothing for honest thought. He often mocked the sophists gently, saying, "They make young men pay for the illusion of wisdom, while I give them the reality of ignorance for free." The line always drew laughter, but there was truth beneath it. He believed that those who claimed to know everything were the most lost. His students saw the difference. With the sophists, they learned how to speak. With Socrates, they learned how to think. Conversations with him were not lessons, they were awakenings. He didn't fill their minds with doctrines, but forced them to build their own ideas from the ground up. To the average Athenian, though, his questioning could feel like an attack. People left their talks with him feeling exposed, uncertain, even humiliated. Few enjoyed discovering how little they understood. In a society that prized confidence and quick wit, Socrates' humility looked like defiance. He once said, "I know that, I know nothing." It wasn't false modesty, it was his entire philosophy. To know nothing was to be open, curious, alive. To claim to know everything was to be blind. As his influence grew, so did resentment. The sophists mocked him as a fraud who hid behind questions because he had no answers. Politicians accused him of corrupting the youth, teaching them to disrespect their elders. But his students saw something deeper. They saw a man who believed that truth could survive only if it was tested. He never forced his ideas on anyone. He didn't demand agreement. He simply asked, and in asking, made people think. For Socrates, teaching was not the transfer of knowledge, but the awakening of the soul. In the evenings, he would often be surrounded by a small circle of students, their faces lit by lamplight. They debated justice, virtue, and the good life. The city around them still buzzed with politics and theater, but in those quiet moments, something eternal was taking shape. A new way of thinking that would outlast empires. What began as simple questions in a crowded marketplace had become a revolution in thought. Socrates had turned conversation into philosophy, argument into discovery, and doubt into wisdom. His method was not just how he taught, it was how he lived. And though he never sought fame, his words spread far beyond Athens. They would echo through Plato, through Aristotle, and through every thinker who ever dared to ask why. Yet, in his lifetime, few understood the depth of what he was doing. To most, he was still just a barefoot old man who refused to stop asking questions. He didn't mind. To him, that was enough. Because as long as people questioned, truth would never die. Over time, the power of his questions began to ripple through Athens. What started as quiet conversations in the agora had grown into a movement of minds. Young Athenians from every corner of the city sought him out, drawn by his strange wisdom and the freedom his words inspired. They found in Socrates something no sophist could offer, the courage to think for themselves. Yet that very courage made him dangerous. The city prized cleverness, not reflection. The citizens loved to argue, but few loved to doubt. And Socrates, more than anyone, made them doubt. He would stand in the marketplace, a small crowd gathering as his soft voice challenged ideas that had stood for generations. Once, a proud general boasted that he understood courage better than anyone. Socrates nodded, listening carefully, and then asked, "Tell me, then is courage merely standing firm in danger, or is it knowing when to stand and when to withdraw?" The general replied that courage was endurance. Socrates smiled. "Then is a man who endures in ignorance courageous, or merely stubborn?" The laughter of the crowd filled the air. The general, red-faced, had no answer. Socrates didn't laugh. He simply thanked him and walked away. For Socrates, the goal was never victory. It was awakening. His method was slow, sometimes frustrating, but always revealing. He called it elenchus cross-examination, By asking and answering, he guided others to expose contradictions in their own thinking. It was less a debate and more a dissection of the soul. Those who stayed with him long enough learned not just to question others, but to question themselves. Yet that very courage made him dangerous. The city prized cleverness, not reflection. The citizens loved to argue, but few loved to doubt. And Socrates, more than anyone, made them doubt. He would stand in the marketplace, a small crowd gathering as his soft voice challenged ideas that had stood for generations. Once, a proud general boasted that he understood courage better than anyone. Socrates nodded, listening carefully, and then asked, "Tell me, then, is courage merely standing firm in danger, or is it knowing when to stand and when to withdraw?" The general replied that courage was endurance. Socrates smiled. "Then is a man who endures in ignorance courageous or merely stubborn?" The laughter of the crowd filled the air. The general, red-faced, had no answer. Socrates didn't laugh, he simply thanked him and walked away. For Socrates, the goal was never victory, it was awakening. His method was slow, sometimes frustrating, but always revealing. He called it Elenchus cross-examination. By asking and answering, he guided others to expose contradictions in their own thinking. It was less a debate and more a dissection of the soul. Those who stayed with him long enough learned not just to question others, but to question themselves. Among his companions, Plato was the most devoted. He followed Socrates everywhere, writing down their conversations with the precision of a poet. Others, like Alcibiades, admired him for different reasons: his strength, his fearlessness, his calm under pressure. To Alcibiades, Socrates was a living mystery, poor, plain, barefoot, yet utterly unshakable. Athens was full of men who spoke with power, but none who spoke with such honesty. Socrates never tried to sound wise. In fact, he often insisted he knew nothing. But in that humility, others found depth. He could take any topic, love, justice, virtue, and turn it inside out until its hidden heart was revealed. At banquets, when others drank and argued about beauty, Socrates would quietly ask, "What makes something beautiful? The form, the purpose, or the eyes that see it?" The laughter would fade. People would pause, thinking, searching for an answer that never came easily. He made philosophy something living, something that could happen anywhere in a marketplace, a gymnasium, or over a cup of wine. The sophists, who made their fortune selling rhetoric, began to grow restless. They saw how Socrates drew crowds without charging a single drachma. They mocked him for pretending to be poor while commanding influence among the youth. "He's just another sophist," they whispered, "but one who hides his ambition behind false modesty." But Socrates never competed with them. In his mind, they were merchants of language, traders in words. He sought truth, not applause. The sophists taught how to win an argument. Socrates taught how to understand oneself. One afternoon, a wealthy student asked why he refused payment when he clearly had followers. Socrates looked at him and said, "If a doctor takes money to heal the sick, his reward is their health. If I take money to heal the soul, what happens when the cure fails?" The student had no answer. His life remained as simple as his speech. He owned almost nothing, wore the same cloak through summer and winter, and ate whatever was given to him. Yet those who knew him said no man was freer. He didn't depend on wealth, comfort, or public favor. His peace came from within, but that peace came at a price. Many of Athens' most powerful men began to resent him. They said he embarrassed them in public, that he twisted words to confuse others, that he disrespected the gods by questioning everything sacred. He was accused of filling young minds with doubt and turning them against tradition. And yet, the young adored him. They followed him everywhere, not for answers, but for the thrill of discovery. They loved how he could make a simple idea unfold into something vast. To them, Socrates wasn't just a teacher. He was a mirror reflecting the truth they were afraid to see. As the years passed, the city around him began to change. The brilliance of Athens was dimming. Political corruption spread. The old confidence began to crack, but Socrates never wavered. His method, his patience, his questions, they remained constant, like a stone in a river that refused to be moved by the current. Sometimes, late in the day, when the crowds thinned and the agora quieted, he would walk home with a few students at his side. They would ask him what he truly believed. He would smile softly and say, "I believe that the unexamined life is not worth living." Those words sank deep. They were more than a statement. They were a challenge to think, to question, to never stop searching. For Socrates, knowledge was not a destination but a journey, and ignorance was the map that guided it. He believed that every conversation, every question, brought humanity a little closer to truth. And though he didn't know it yet, those conversations, those long afternoons in the agora, would one day shape the foundation of Western thought itself. But Athens was changing fast, and not everyone wanted to be questioned anymore. The same curiosity that once made the city great was turning into suspicion. The age of conversation was giving way to the age of conflict. Socrates kept teaching, kept asking, kept believing, yet beneath the shining marble of the Parthenon, shadows were beginning to grow, shadows that would one day fall over the man who devoted his life to the pursuit of truth. As the years passed, the quiet figure who roamed the agora was no longer just a curious thinker. He had become a presence, familiar, debated, loved, and despised in equal measure. His questions had reached every corner of Athenian life, and wherever he went, a small circle followed. They came not for lessons in the ordinary sense, but for something deeper, a way of seeing the world that could not be bought, memorized, or easily forgotten. Among those who followed him most faithfully was Plato, the young son of a noble Athenian family. At first, Plato dreamed of a political career, as many young men of his class did. But after meeting Socrates, everything changed. He once wrote that Socrates was like a torpedo fish, stunning those who touched him into stillness. In his company, words seemed to lose their usual shape. Opinions melted away, and what remained was a haunting clarity, the realization that one knew almost nothing at all. Plato began to record their conversations, first as notes, later as dialogues. Through these writings, he preserved not just Socrates' arguments, but his spirit, the calm voice, the playful irony, the relentless logic. To Plato, Socrates was not only a teacher, but a model of what a philosopher should be, fearless in pursuit of truth, unmoved by wealth or fame, devoted only to wisdom. Another of his companions was Xenophon, a soldier and historian, practical and disciplined, a man of action rather than contemplation. Xenophon admired Socrates for his steadiness, for the moral strength that carried him through war and hardship. He saw in him a man who lived his own philosophy, temperate, courageous, and utterly self-controlled. Through Xenophon's eyes, Socrates appeared less like a puzzling thinker and more like a moral guide, a man who embodied virtue in daily life. Then there was Alcibiades, brilliant, beautiful, and dangerously ambitious. He was a young aristocrat with the charm of a politician and the hunger of a conqueror. To many, Alcibiades was destined to rule Athens. To Socrates, he was a test proof of how knowledge could illuminate greatness or destroy it. Socrates saw in him immense potential, but also arrogance and restlessness. He tried to guide him, to teach him that true leadership came from self-knowledge, not power. One night, at a banquet, Alcibiades drunkenly confessed before the guests that no man had ever affected him as Socrates did. He said that when Socrates spoke, his heart raced and his eyes filled with tears, because he knew he was being shown a part of himself he had never dared to see. But even that confession couldn't save him from his own nature. Ambition led Alcibiades to betray, to change sides in war, to chase glory until it consumed him. For Socrates, his fall was a painful reminder that knowledge alone could not save a soul unwilling to listen. Beyond these famous names were dozens of others, students, craftsmen, merchants, even slaves, all drawn by the same magnetic simplicity. Socrates treated them as equals. He cared little for birth or rank. What mattered to him was curiosity, honesty, and the willingness to search. In the crowded streets of Athens, anyone might find themselves caught in one of his dialogues. A potter, a soldier, a politician, or a poet. His influence on the youth became one of the most talked about features of Athenian life. Parents warned their sons not to fall under his spell, while others sent them eagerly to listen. Some feared that he made the young disrespect authority. Others believed he was awakening a new generation of thinkers. The truth lay somewhere in between. He didn't tell his students what to think, he taught them how to think. To the older generation, this was dangerous. The Athens of Pericles had once been confident, united in pride. But the Athens of Socrates' time was weary, scarred by war, shaken by political shifts, uncertain of its own values. The young, restless and idealistic found in Socrates a voice that reflected their doubts. He didn't offer answers, he offered freedom, and freedom often threatens those who depend on control. He never opened a school or charged a fee. His classroom was the open air, his lessons woven into everyday life. He spoke with beggars and generals, with scholars and shopkeepers. To him, every human being was capable of wisdom, if only they were willing to question their own ignorance. This belief that truth belonged to everyone made him both loved and hated. In the eyes of many Athenians, Socrates' followers became a mirror of his influence. Some, like Plato, devoted their lives to philosophy. Others, like Alcibiades, took his lessons in their own direction, for better or worse. Over time, the city began to associate him with rebellion, with the kind of dangerous thinking that unsettled the peace. When one of his former students, Critias, became a leader during the brief and bloody rule of the 30 tyrants, public opinion turned sharply. To some, Socrates had planted the seeds of defiance in the hearts of the young, who later betrayed democracy. He never defended himself publicly. When people accused him of corrupting the youth, he simply replied that he never taught anything untrue. He only helped others discover what they already believed. Still, the damage was done. The man who once stood as the city's conscience was slowly being painted as its enemy. But within his circle, loyalty remained unshaken. Those who knew him closely saw how little he cared for power, how far he stood from the scheming of politicians. They admired the way he lived, with integrity, patience, and peace. He never flattered, never feared, never compromised the truth. When a wealthy friend once offered to buy him fine clothes, he refused, saying, "If my nature needed them, I would have them already." In conversation, he could be both gentle and ruthless. He questioned others not to humiliate but to heal. The soul, he often said, is like a garden. It must be tended by truth, or it will be overgrown with lies. His students began to repeat his sayings around the city. Some wrote them down. Others used them in their own debates. Slowly, the thoughts of one man began to echo through the minds of hundreds. For Socrates, teaching was not about filling minds, but stirring them. He believed that wisdom was not taught but born, drawn out, like a midwife brings forth a child. Perhaps this belief came from his mother Phanerit, who had brought life into the world with her hands. He brought life into the world with his words. In time, his circle would grow into a lineage. Plato would build his academy. Xenophon would write histories that carried Socrates' image to future generations. Even Aristotle, born years after Socrates' death, would walk the path that began with those simple conversations in the Athenian marketplace. His influence reached beyond philosophy into politics, art, ethics, and the very idea of reason itself. He made questioning sacred bed. He gave the act of thinking moral weight. And though he never wrote a single word, his students carried his voice forward across centuries. Yet, as his fame grew, so did the whispers. Some said he mocked the gods. Others said he turned young men against the city. The democracy that once celebrated free thought now began to fear it. And in that fear, suspicion found a name. Socrates had always believed that truth must be pursued, no matter the cost. He could not have known how heavy that cost was about to become. The older Socrates grew, the quieter his life became, yet the deeper his influence spread. The noisy streets of Athens had seen him 1,000 times before, standing beneath the shadow of the Acropolis, his face lit by the same sun that watched the city rise and falter. But by now, people no longer gathered around him merely to watch the strange man who asked questions. They came because those questions had begun to change them. Everything about Socrates revolved around one simple idea: know thyself. The words were carved on the stone of Apollo's temple at Delphi, but in Socrates they became a living commandment. To him, the greatest ignorance was not failing to know the world, but failing to understand one's own soul. He believed that true wisdom began with humility. To know oneself meant to recognize how little one truly knew. Most people, he said, lived asleep, confident in their opinions, blind to their contradictions. The first step toward wisdom was not learning something new, but realizing how much you didn't know at all. He often told his companions that virtue and knowledge were the same thing. To him, a man who truly knew what was good would naturally do good. Evil, therefore, was not born from wicked hearts, but from ignorance, from people acting without understanding. No one, he said, chooses to do wrong on purpose. They simply mistake the wrong for the right. In this way, Socrates turned ethics into a science of the soul. He believed every human being carried within them a moral compass, waiting to be uncovered through honest reflection. The unexamined life is not worth living, he said, not as a threat, but as an invitation. To examine life was to look inward, to question your motives, to purify your heart through understanding. When Athenians debated wealth, power, and victory, Socrates asked about justice, courage, and goodness. To him, these weren't abstract words, they were the true measures of a person's worth. He said that a man who knows what is just will not fear the loss of money or reputation. True happiness, he insisted, could never come from possessions or politics, only from harmony within the soul. He spoke of virtue not as something granted by birth or taught in schools, but as something achieved through reason and self-awareness. Virtue was not inherited, it was earned. He described it as a kind of inner balance, the alignment of knowledge, intention, and action. A man who understood justice would act justly, just as a musician who knows harmony cannot bear to play out of tune. In Athens, these ideas were revolutionary. The city prized cleverness and debate, yet few stopped to ask whether their words made them better people. The sophists taught the art of persuasion, how to make the weaker argument appear stronger. But Socrates cared nothing for winning arguments. He cared only for truth, and truth, he said, could not be sold. This made him a quiet enemy of corruption. Athens, still recovering from war and political upheaval, was filled with men eager for influence and wealth. They wore fine robes, spoke with confidence, and boasted of wisdom. Socrates stripped their pride bare with a few questions. If you were so wise, he would ask, why do your actions not reflect your wisdom? He refused to flatter politicians or bend to public opinion. When the powerful sought to please the crowd, he reminded them that justice was not determined by majority vote. It is better, he said, to suffer wrong than to do wrong. In a city where ambition and deceit often ruled, such words were unsettling. Many of his conversations centered on the soul, not as a religious symbol, but as the essence of one's moral being. To Socrates, the soul was what made a person truly alive. Caring for the soul meant caring for one's virtue. Just as a body sickens from neglect, so too does a soul decay from lies and selfishness. A person could gain the whole world, he warned, and yet lose themselves in the process. He believed that a good life was one guided by reason, and that reason was divine. It connected humanity to something greater, not through rituals or sacrifices, but through thought and moral clarity. The gods, he said, were good and just, and therefore they could never demand evil acts from men. This belief placed him at odds with traditional religion. Many accused him of doubting the gods of the city, but Socrates never denied them. He simply refused to believe they were as petty or cruel as humans imagined. His ethics also reached into politics. He refused to participate in corruption even when ordered to. During the rule of the 30 tyrants, he was commanded to arrest an innocent man. He refused, knowing it could cost him his life. A good man, he said, should never act unjustly, even if the world around him does. For him, moral duties stood higher than obedience. Students often asked him how to live a good life. He would smile and tell them to look inward. Do not care for your reputation more than your soul, he said. Do not chase wealth or victory, but the good itself. If you know what is right, you will do what is right. His view of virtue was inseparable from his view of happiness. He taught that true happiness came not from pleasure or success but from harmony, the state in which one's thoughts, words, and actions agreed. A man who lied, cheated, or sought power for its own sake might win in the short term, but would live in conflict with himself. Only the virtuous could be free. To many, this was both inspiring and frightening. Socrates made people see the gap between who they were and who they ought to be. He offered no easy answers, no doctrines to follow. His philosophy was a mirror, and in that mirror, people saw both their ignorance and their potential. In a society built on appearances, he was a man of substance. When others argued for victory, he argued for understanding. When they sought pleasure, he sought truth. And when they feared death, he embraced it as part of nature's order, saying that no harm can come to a good man, in life or in death. The phrase, "Know thyself," became more than a saying. It became his mission to wake a sleeping city, to remind its people that true greatness lay not in empire or wealth, but in the care of the soul. Through questions and reason, he tried to guide Athens back to its moral center. But the city had grown impatient with questions. Its leaders no longer saw wisdom in his calm defiance, only danger. His students adored him. His critics grew louder. The same truths that once made him beloved were now seen as rebellion. His life, shaped by reason and guided by virtue, was moving toward its greatest test, a test that would decide not only his fate, but the fate of philosophy itself. His belief in virtue as the highest good was not just theory, it was a way of living. Every day, Socrates walked the same streets where merchants haggled, soldiers boasted, and politicians made promises they never intended to keep. To most, it was the rhythm of life. To him, it was the sound of people forgetting what mattered most. He saw how the pursuit of wealth and status corrupted even the most intelligent men. They spoke eloquently about justice in the assembly, yet cheated their neighbors in private. They praised virtue in public, but sold their loyalty for silver. Socrates found this hypocrisy unbearable. For him, virtue was not a word to be spoken, but a truth to be lived. He reminded people that justice was not a performance, but a discipline, something that began inside, in the silence of the soul. It is not the fine words that make a man good, he said, but the harmony between what he says and what he does. To him, morality was not about obeying laws. It was about aligning oneself with truth. In the marketplaces and gymnasiums, he spoke of the soul as the most precious possession a person could have. He told Athenians to care for it more than for their bodies, their wealth, or their reputation. You polish your shoes, he said, but you leave your soul in dust. It was a statement that cut deep, especially in a city that loved appearances more than sincerity. Athens was proud of its democracy, but Socrates saw how easily public opinion could be manipulated. He watched as clever orators swayed the crowd with emotion, not reason. To him, democracy was only as good as the wisdom of its citizens, and most citizens, he feared, were not wise. He didn't despise democracy, but he distrusted ignorance dressed as confidence. The city wanted agreeable voices. Socrates offered a mirror. He warned that when people stop examining themselves, when they let comfort replace truth, corruption follows. When the soul grows lazy, he said, it begins to love the pleasant more than the good. He urged his students to resist that temptation, to choose the harder path of self-knowledge. His conversations often led into uncomfortable territory. Once, a wealthy politician asked him how to make the city better. Socrates replied, "First, make yourself better. The city is only as just as the men who rule it." The politician left in silence, angry but thoughtful. For Socrates, reforming the world without reforming oneself was hypocrisy in its purest form. He believed that knowledge and virtue were bound together. To know the good was to desire it. Ignorance was the true source of evil. People did wrong not because they wanted to, but because they misunderstood what was truly valuable. If they could see clearly, they would choose rightly. This belief gave his teaching a kind of quiet hope. No one, he said, was beyond redemption. Every soul could awaken. Every person could find truth if they were willing to face themselves honestly. It was not a priest's promise of salvation, but a philosopher's faith in reason. Socrates' moral philosophy stood against everything. Athens was becoming a city, proud of its intellect but blind to its decay. When the Peloponnesian War drained its spirit and politics turned bitter, many Athenians sought comfort in wealth, flattery, or superstition. Socrates urged them to return to simplicity and truth. He said that peace could not be built on lies, and that a city that neglected virtue would eventually destroy itself from within. He refused to compromise with corruption. When appointed to public office, he would not bend to pressure or bribes. Once, during a trial of generals accused after a naval disaster, the assembly demanded an illegal mass execution. Socrates alone opposed it, standing firm against the crowd. His voice was calm, steady, and full of conviction. "I will obey the law," he said, "not the anger of the people." Moments like that defined him. He wasn't a politician, yet he lived with more integrity than those who governed. He wasn't rich, yet his honesty was a treasure no man could buy. He wasn't powerful, yet his courage commanded respect, even from his enemies. Still, his defiance had a cost. Those who lived by lies could not tolerate the man who exposed them. The powerful began to whisper that Socrates was dangerous, that he turned young men against tradition, that his questions led to rebellion. The same voice that once inspired admiration now inspired fear. But Socrates continued, unshaken. He believed that doing right was its own reward, and that to compromise truth for safety was to lose both. When his friends worried about his growing number of enemies, he would smile and say, "If doing what is right angers them, then I am glad to have made them honest." His ethics were not lofty ideals meant for books. They were daily practices: honesty, moderation, courage, justice. He lived by example, proving that philosophy was not a matter of words but of living rightly. He owned almost nothing, ate little, and never sought luxury. He said that the fewer one's needs, the closer one lived to the gods. And yet, there was a gentleness in him. He loved laughter, music, and simple friendship. He could spend hours in conversation, listening more than he spoke. His students said that when he talked about the soul, his eyes seemed to look past the world around him, as if he was speaking to something eternal. He often compared his role to that of a midwife, not giving birth to knowledge himself, but helping others give birth to truth within them. Just as his mother brought life into the world, he brought awareness into the minds of men. "I am a midwife of the soul," he said. "I help others bring forth understanding." Through this quiet labor, he shaped minds that would define philosophy for centuries. Plato, Aristippus, Antisthenes, each took from him a different seed of thought. Some grew into idealism, others into cynicism or hedonism, but all began in the soil of Socrates' teachings, nourished by his relentless pursuit of virtue and truth. Still, for all his influence, Athens was growing restless. The same questioning that once made Socrates the city's conscience now made him a threat. His attacks on corruption, his refusal to flatter the powerful, his insistence that virtue mattered more than loyalty. These things stirred unease. He stood as a mirror in front of the city, reflecting its soul back to itself. And Athens, like most people, could not bear the sight for long. The whispers became accusations, the admiration turned into resentment, and the line between philosopher and enemy began to blur. Socrates, however, remained exactly as he had always been, calm, humble, and unafraid. He had spent his life teaching others to know themselves. Now, that teaching would be tested in the most severe way possible. The time was coming when Athens would ask him to prove, with his life, whether virtue was truly stronger than fear. The Athens that Socrates once loved was not the same city anymore. The golden age of Pericles had faded into memory. The Peloponnesian War had left deep scars, not just on its walls, but on its spirit. Once proud and powerful, Athens was now a city haunted by defeat, poverty, and mistrust. The war had broken more than armies. It had broken the people's confidence in their leaders. In the chaos that followed, political factions fought for control. Democrats, oligarchs, generals, and orators, all blaming each other for the city's downfall. Amid this turmoil, one man continued to question everyone: Socrates. He had survived the war and its aftermath with his integrity intact, but his honesty was no longer welcome. His questions, once admired, now sounded dangerous in a city desperate for unity and stability. While most Athenians sought comfort in easy answers, Socrates kept asking hard questions. He reminded citizens that wisdom meant knowing how little they truly knew. To wounded pride, that sounded like insult. He told politicians that no man was fit to rule unless he understood justice, a truth that few of them wanted to hear. When the oligarchic government of the 30 tyrants took power in 404 BCE, Athens plunged into fear. Hundreds of citizens were executed without trial. Property was seized. Friends turned on friends. Socrates, though disgusted by their cruelty, refused to flee or join them. Even when one of the tyrants, Critias, his former student, ordered him to arrest an innocent man, Socrates simply walked away. He would not obey an unjust command. But when the democracy was restored a year later, suspicion followed him. People remembered that some of his students, like Critias and Alcibiades, had betrayed the city. They whispered that Socrates' teachings had inspired rebellion, that he had poisoned the minds of Athens' youth with dangerous ideas about questioning authority. It didn't help that Socrates often criticized democracy itself. He said that choosing leaders by popular vote was like choosing a ship's captain by lottery. "Would you let anyone steer a ship without training?" he asked. "Then why let anyone govern without wisdom?" His words, though logical, struck a nerve. After years of war, Athenians wanted to believe in their system, even if it was flawed. To hear a citizen, especially one so respected, doubt democracy felt like betrayal. The city's mood was tense. Fear of instability lingered. The wounds of war were fresh. People were eager to find someone to blame for their suffering, someone who could explain how Athens, once the world's greatest city, had fallen so low. And Socrates, with his sharp tongue and refusal to conform, was an easy target. Rumors began to spread that he mocked the gods, that he introduced new deities, that he taught the young to challenge their elders and disrespect tradition. His open criticism of authority made enemies among politicians, generals, and even some of the city's priests. In truth, Socrates never denied the gods, but his understanding of them was different. He spoke of a divine inner voice, a guiding spirit he called his daemonion. It warned him against wrongdoing, he said, but it did not give him commands. To some, that sounded like heresy. To others, it was madness. Slowly, the accusations took shape. The same Athens that once admired his wisdom now feared his influence. People whispered that his questions led to doubt, and that doubt led to chaos. For a city already broken by war, that was too much to bear. His students still gathered round him in the marketplace, eager to listen. Young men like Plato, Crito, and Apollodorus, but now, angry eyes followed them. What had once looked like philosophy now looked like conspiracy. The atmosphere grew heavy with resentment. Those in power saw an opportunity to silence a voice that made them uncomfortable. To them, Socrates was not a philosopher. He was a threat to the fragile order they were trying to rebuild. And so, in 399 BCE, 3 men, Miletus, Anytus, and Lycon, formally brought charges against him. The accusations were clear and dangerous. He was charged with impiety for corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods of the city. Socrates' response was calm, almost indifferent. He had spent his life preparing for truth, not for popularity. When his friends urged him to defend himself more carefully, he smiled and said, "If I have spent my life speaking truth, why should I start lying now?" As news of the trial spread, Athens divided once again. Some believed he was a martyr for reason. Others saw him as a rebel against tradition. The streets buzzed with arguments about gods, justice, and freedom. It was as if the soul of Athens itself were on trial. The old philosopher, now 70 years old, walked to court as he always had, barefoot, calm, and unafraid. The same man who once questioned generals and poets would now stand before the people's jury. For decades, Socrates had forced Athens to look at itself. Now, it would decide what to do with the reflection it saw. The accusations did not come all at once. They grew slowly, like a storm forming on the horizon. Socrates could feel it coming, though he never showed fear. For years, whispers followed him through the agora. The same place where he had spent decades questioning men now became the place where his own name was questioned. Men who had once admired his wisdom began to avoid him. Former students distanced themselves, fearing guilt by association. The stage, once a place of art and laughter, became a weapon used to shape public opinion. Athens had changed. Its people were wounded, proud, and uncertain. They wanted answers, not questions. And Socrates offered only questions. In the minds of many Athenians, that was dangerous. A man who made others doubt was a man who could make others rebel. It didn't matter that Socrates never led a revolt, never raised a weapon, never called for violence. His ideas were his rebellion, and his words were sharper than swords. To understand the fear surrounding him, one must remember what Athens had endured. The city had lost its empire, its navy, its wealth. Once, it ruled the seas and commanded respect from every Greek state. Now, its pride was bruised, its democracy fragile. The Athenians had seen their heroes fail, their generals betray them, and their faith shaken. In this fragile peace, they clung to their traditions. The gods, the laws, the civic order. These were the few things that gave them a sense of stability. And then came Socrates, still walking barefoot through the marketplace, still asking men of power if they truly knew what justice meant, or what virtue was. His presence was like a mirror held up to a city that didn't want to see itself anymore. And for that, they began to turn against him. His enemies accused him of corrupting the youth. They said he filled young minds with arrogance and disrespect, that he taught them to challenge their fathers and mock authority. But the truth was more subtle. Socrates had taught his students to think, truly think. He told them that blindly obeying others was not virtue, that a life without examination was not worth living. To those who feared change, that kind of thinking was dangerous. The charge of impiety, disrespecting the gods, was equally twisted. Socrates believed in the divine, but not in the way the city expected. He spoke often of his inner voice, his daemonion, a spiritual sign that guided his conscience. To his followers, this seemed noble and mysterious. To his critics, it sounded like blasphemy. the claim that he communed with a private god, outside the traditional religion of Athens. People began to ask, if Socrates did not believe in our gods, whose gods did he believe in? And if he taught our sons to question the very foundations of belief, what would stop them from questioning the laws, or the city itself? The tension grew thicker. Even in the streets, people debated his influence. Some admired his courage, calling him the last honest man in Athens. Others cursed him, saying his words were poison. In the city's assembly and courts, men began to see him not as a philosopher, but as a threat to public order. Still, Socrates refused to defend himself in the way politicians did. When confronted, he asked more questions. When insulted, he smiled. When warned to stay silent, he replied that silence would betray his purpose. His student Plato would later write that Socrates saw philosophy as a kind of divine mission, a calling to awaken people from the sleep of ignorance. He believed he was sent by the gods not to teach doctrines, but to challenge illusions. "I am a gadfly," he once said, "sent to sting the lazy horse that is Athens." But Athens had grown tired of being stung. His enemies found an opportunity when public anger reached its peak. 3 men, Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon, decided to make their move. Each came from a different group of Athenian society. Meletus, a poet; Anytus, a powerful politician and supporter of democracy; and Lycon, an orator. Together, they represented the 3 pillars of Athenian public life: art, politics, and speech, all of which Socrates had challenged. Their accusation was carefully crafted. They accused him of corrupting the youth, rejecting the gods of the city, and introducing new divinities. These charges struck directly at the heart of what it meant to be Athenian. To deny the city's gods was to deny the city itself. Socrates' friends urged him to avoid the trial. Some offered to help him escape. Others suggested he tone down his criticism. But Socrates would not. To flee would mean admitting guilt. To change his speech would mean betraying philosophy. He told them that a philosopher's duty was not to please others, but to seek truth, even if it led to death. To fear death, he said, is to think oneself wise when one is not. We do not know whether death is the greatest evil or the greatest good. His calmness frightened people more than his words. In a city full of anxiety, here was a man unshaken by fear or politics. A man who stood against the tide of public opinion, not out of pride, but out of principle. As his trial approached, Athens seemed to hold its breath. The streets buzzed with argument. The philosophers debated in the gymnasiums. The politicians whispered in the council halls. The dramatists prepared new plays mocking the old man. And through it all, Socrates walked quietly through the same city he had always loved, the city that had once celebrated its thinkers and now prepared to silence one. He had often said that no one willingly does wrong, only out of ignorance. Perhaps he still believed that, even now, that those who accused him were not evil, only blind. But Athens, restless and uncertain, had made its choice. The trial of Socrates was no longer just about one man. It was about a city wrestling with its conscience, a city deciding whether the freedom to question was still worth defending. As he prepared to face his accusers, the philosopher who had spent his life asking questions would finally become the question himself. The day of the trial arrived. Athens was awake early, filled with a strange energy. Citizens crowded around the court, whispering about the old man who dared to challenge their city. Some came out of curiosity, others out of anger, and a few, quietly, out of respect. Socrates walked through the streets as he always did, calm, barefoot, his face serene. He was 70 years old now, but there was nothing weak about him. His eyes still carried that piercing look, the one that could cut through pride and pretense. He didn't bring notes or lawyers. He didn't beg for mercy. He came to speak the truth, as he had done all his life. Inside the great hall, 500 Athenian jurors sat waiting. They were ordinary men, farmers, craftsmen, soldiers, chosen by lot to decide the philosopher's fate. Before them stood Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon, his accusers. Meletus, the poet, was the youngest, thin and nervous but eager to speak. Anytus, the politician, carried himself with the confidence of a man sure of his cause. Lycon, the orator, stood ready to sway the crowd with practiced words. They accused Socrates of 3 crimes: corrupting the youth of Athens, rejecting the gods of the city, and introducing new deities. In other words, they said, he was a danger to religion, morality, and the state itself. When Meletus finished his speech, the crowd murmured. The old philosopher stood quietly, hands folded behind his back. Then he began to speak, not to plead, not to flatter, but to reason. His defense, remembered by Plato in the Apology, is one of the most remarkable speeches in history. Socrates began by saying that he was no skilled speaker, that he had never practiced the art of persuasion. Yet as soon as he spoke, every ear turned toward him. His words were calm but powerful, his logic unshakable. He said that he had never corrupted anyone. If he had influenced young men, it was only to help them think for themselves. He had never charged money for teaching, unlike the sophists, who sold wisdom as if it were a trade. If I have made them question things, he said, it is because questioning is the beginning of wisdom. As for impiety, Socrates declared that he believed in the divine more deeply than his accusers did. He spoke of his daemonion, the inner voice that warned him from wrongdoing, and said it was proof that something divine watched over him. I am not impious, he said. I am guided by God. He reminded the jury that his mission was not self-chosen, but divine. Men of Athens, he said, I am like a gadfly sent by the gods to sting the lazy horse that is our city. Without me, you might sleep forever. I awaken you, I challenge you, I urge you to care for your souls more than for wealth or fame. Some jurors shifted uneasily, others nodded, conflicted. The philosopher's words were fearless, but they also sounded proud. When asked why he could not simply stop questioning people, he smiled. Because, he said, the unexamined life is not worth living. The crowd gasped. It was a simple sentence, but it cut deep. Everyone in that hall knew what he meant. That truth mattered more than comfort, and integrity more than survival. But his honesty came at a price. Athens wanted remorse. The jury wanted humility. Instead, Socrates gave them truth. He could have apologized, flattered the jurors, or blamed misunderstanding. Many expected him to beg for mercy. Instead, he did the opposite. He told them that, if Athens were wise, they would not punish him but reward him. If I am guilty of anything, he said, it is of serving the gods and helping men seek virtue. For this, I deserve not death, but a meal at the public table, as we give to the victors of the Olympic Games. A wave of laughter and anger swept the court. His friends watched in disbelief. To them, his courage was inspiring, but they also saw what it would cost him. When the votes were counted, the decision was close, but not close enough. By a narrow margin, the jury found him guilty. Under Athenian law, the convicted could propose their own punishment. Socrates could have chosen exile or a fine. His friends, including Plato and Crito, were ready to pay whatever amount was needed. But Socrates refused to compromise his principles. He said, perhaps you think that by killing men you can prevent someone from reproaching you for not living rightly. But you are mistaken. There will be others to test you, younger men who will question you even more. Then he paused and added, to fear death is to think oneself wise when one is not. No one knows whether death is not the greatest of all blessings. His words unsettled the jury. To some, he sounded like a man who had already risen above life itself. But to others, he sounded arrogant, defiant, even in judgment. When the final vote was cast, the sentence was death. The court fell silent. The philosopher who had spent his life questioning others would now face the one question no mortal can avoid. In the days that followed, Socrates remained in prison. His friends visited often, Plato, Crito, Apollodorus, and others, bringing food, conversation, and plans for escape. Crito even arranged for a ship and bribes to the guards. But Socrates refused. He said that escaping would contradict everything he had taught. He had lived his life obeying the laws of Athens, even when he criticized them. To disobey them now would be to destroy his own integrity. Would it be just, he asked, to save my life by breaking the very laws I have respected? His friends begged him. Plato later wrote that Socrates' calmness frightened them more than his sentence. He spent his last days discussing philosophy, the immortality of the soul, the nature of virtue, and the meaning of death. He said that death was not to be feared, because it was either a peaceful sleep or a journey to another world where he might meet wiser souls. When the time came, the jailer entered quietly, carrying a small cup. Inside was a liquid of deadly hemlock. The room fell silent. His students tried to hold back tears. Socrates took the cup with steady hands. "What must I do?" he asked. The guard told him to walk until his legs grew heavy, then lie down. He smiled softly. "We owe a cock to Asclepius," he said, a reference to the god of healing. "Do not forget to pay the debt." Those were his last words. Too many, they seemed mysterious. But perhaps he meant that death was a kind of healing, the final cure for the sickness of life's illusions. He drank the poison without hesitation. Slowly, his body began to grow numb. His friends wept openly now, but Socrates only comforted them. "Be calm," he said. "It is natural." The poison rose through his body. He lay back as the cold reached his chest. His final breath left him peacefully. The man who had never written a word left behind, no books, no monuments, no wealth, only his example and the memory of a life devoted to truth. When the news spread, Athens felt a strange silence. Some rejoiced that the troublemaker was gone. Others, especially the young, felt shame. They realized too late that they had killed their wisest citizen. Plato, who had watched his teacher die, would later write that Socrates was the best, wisest, and most just man of all we have known. From that moment, he made it his life's mission to preserve Socrates' voice, to ensure that the man Athens condemned would never be forgotten. And he succeeded. Through the writings of his students, Socrates became immortal, not in body, but in spirit. His questions continued to echo through centuries. What is virtue? What is justice? What is the good life? Even now, thousands of years later, his words still challenge us to question, to think, to know ourselves. For the man Athens killed in fear became the conscience of all who seek truth without fear. When Socrates' voice finally fell silent in that Athenian prison, something remarkable happened. The city that condemned him thought it had silenced a man, but in truth, it had set his words free. His ideas began to travel, first through the hearts of his students, then through the centuries, shaping the very foundations of Western thought. One of those students was Plato. He was young at the time of the trial, but deeply devoted to his teacher. The image of Socrates standing calm before the jury never left him. In that calmness, Plato saw a new kind of strength, not the strength of warriors, but of wisdom and conviction. After Socrates' death, Plato left Athens for years, disillusioned with politics and human ignorance. But wherever he went, he carried his teacher's voice within him. When he finally returned, he founded the Academy, the first great school of philosophy in the Western world. In the Academy's gardens, Plato kept Socrates alive through words. He wrote dialogues, vivid conversations, in which Socrates once again questioned the world. In these works, the Republic, the Symposium, Phaedo, and many others, Socrates walked, spoke, and taught again, guiding readers toward truth. Through Plato, the spirit of Socrates became immortal. And from Plato came another great mind, Aristotle. Though Aristotle never met Socrates, he was the intellectual grandson of the man who questioned everything. From Plato's Academy, Aristotle would go on to found his own school, the Lyceum, and his teachings would shape science, logic, ethics, and politics for generations. The line of influence is clear. Socrates taught Plato. Plato taught Aristotle. Aristotle taught Alexander the Great, and through them, the world was changed forever. But Socrates' influence did not stop with philosophy. It reached into education itself. His method, the art of questioning, of learning through dialogue, became the foundation of modern teaching. Today, it's called the Socratic method, used in classrooms, law schools, and debates across the world. It reminds us that true knowledge isn't memorized, it's discovered. Socrates believed that wisdom wasn't something a teacher could hand to a student like a gift. It had to be born from within, drawn out by curiosity and reflection. His mother was a midwife, and he often said that he too was a kind of midwife, but of the mind helping others give birth to their own understanding. That idea changed education forever. It moved learning from rote instruction to self-discovery. It turned philosophy into a living conversation, one that continues even now. His influence also shaped ethics and psychology. Socrates taught that knowledge leads to virtue, that if a person truly understands what is right, they will do what is right. This idea would echo centuries later in the work of thinkers like Immanuel Kant and Carl Jung, who also believed that moral awareness is the heart of human growth. Even modern therapy owes something to Socrates. When psychologists encourage patients to question their own beliefs, to challenge irrational thoughts, they are following a path that began in the streets of ancient Athens, where a barefoot man asked simple, piercing questions until illusions fell away. Socrates did not write a single book, yet his legacy fills libraries. He built no temples, yet his ideas became sacred. He held no office, yet his influence shaped kings, scholars, and revolutionaries. What made him eternal was not his death, but the way he lived, questioning, listening, thinking, and seeking truth even when the world turned against him. More than 2,000 years later, his words still feel personal. Know thyself. That phrase, carved on the temple at Delphi and repeated by Socrates throughout his life, remains one of the most profound challenges ever spoken. It reminds us that the hardest journey is not across oceans or mountains, but within our own minds. In every age, there are voices that question, that challenge comfort and routine. Socrates showed us that such voices are not enemies of society, but its conscience. He proved that truth does not need weapons, only courage. And maybe that's why his story still matters today. In a world full of noise, speed, and endless opinions, we need Socrates more than ever. He reminds us to slow down, to think, to ask, what do I really know? What kind of person am I? His death was not an end, it was the beginning of something far greater. Through his students, through the thinkers who came after, and through every question we ask in search of truth, Socrates lives on. The philosopher who once walked the streets of Athens now walks quietly in our minds, whispering the same challenge he gave to his city. Examine your life, seek wisdom, and never stop asking why. And as we reach the end of this journey, from the birth of a curious boy, Alipus, to the death of a wise man who changed the world, we're left with one powerful truth. The courage to question is the beginning of wisdom. Socrates showed that even one honest voice can shake an entire civilization. His life reminds us that ideas outlive empires, and that truth, once spoken, never dies. If his story moved you, if his questions made you think even for a moment, that's the real legacy of philosophy. That's the gift of Socrates. I hope this story inspired you to look deeper, to question more, and to keep learning about the people and ideas that shaped our world. Thank you for joining me on this journey through history. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel so we can keep exploring the great minds and moments that defined humanity. Let's keep history alive, together. Past image of Socrates fades in, his stone face calm, eyes unblinking. Gentle music rises. The screen slowly transitions to your channel. Discover the past, understand the future,